and welcome back to Between Parts Place and Capitol Hill. I'm your host, Stuart Jeffrey, Gov Editor at Six News.
And I'm Leo Puglisi, Chief Anchor at Six News. Today we're talking all about Labor dissent, a history of dissent within the ALP. And of course, that has been pretty dominant in Australian political headlines, given what's happened with Senator Fatima Payman, who crossed the floor to support Palestinian state recognition and everything that has followed since then. It is obviously notable that something like this happens in Labor, isn't it, Stuart? Because they are so vehemently against floor crossing. It's all about caucus solidarity. Whereas you look at the Liberal Party and you see Bridget Archer crossing the floor on multiple occasions, and she remains in the party. She's not banished for that or anything. Now, Senator Payman doing this is the first time in a while that it's happened federally for Labor. At a state level, there was Kashulia Vagella in Victoria. But really, this goes back a while to the 80s and 90s. Graeme Campbell, who went on to do work with Australia First and One Nation, he crossed the floor and he was well outspoken in the Labor Party, and eventually he was expelled. Here's a clip from the ABC in the mid-90s when Campbell was expelled, and then we're going to have a listen to a bit about Fatima Payman and the situation regarding her and the consequences for what she did.
After repeated breaches of ALP policy, rebel Labor backbencher Graeme Campbell is set to lose pre-selection for the seat of Kalgoorlie. The last straw was Mr Campbell's weekend declaration that Labor's immigration policy and commitment to multiculturalism were stupid.
An unrepentant Graeme Campbell was giving himself a big send-off today.
I can see the headlines now. Campbell sacked for telling the truth. Carmen Lawrence gets the bills paid for telling lies.
When I was crossing the floor, I crossed it knowing that there was going to be the potential expulsion as a consequence. But when I was crossing the floor, it was for my conscience and also understanding that I was standing for the ethos of the Labor Party, what we have put in the platform, what our rank and file members have asked for, what my West Australian constituents have called on. The young people that I've met, whether it's been on encampments, whether it's been during door knocking or at schools I visit, this has been the clear ask. And I've had communities reach out from Perth, Sydney, Melbourne, and, Victoria, New South Wales, rather. I don't want to just, geographically constrain them, but there's been a wide range of communities reaching out to me saying, I wish my local member would, follow you or be able to stand for a just resolution for Gaza, for Palestine. But this is about justice. This is about doing the right thing and being on the right side of history. And I just implore that and hope that by me continuing within the party, I can convince my colleagues to come on board.
I know obviously the party platform of the Labor Party does call for a two-state solution, and there are plenty of pro-Palestine rank and file members, as you've mentioned. But do you think a position like yours, which was directly crossing the floor to directly call for a Palestinian state and really overtly pro-Palestinian positions, do you think that is welcomed right now in terms of in the federal party room and with the current caucus?
I can't speak for my colleagues and everyone else within my caucus, but what I do know and what I've seen and witnessed is the long-term advocacy of many of my colleagues, some that have advocated longer than I've been on this earth for. So it is really important for me to ensure that what I've done isn't just a once-off gesture, but rather I know that this is part of an incremental move towards recognizing Palestine, but also it's about reinstating that hope within our communities, showing them that, yes, we do listen, we are representing your voices, and also it's important that, we were elected to be standing up for our values. It's not a homogenous caucus, so I do understand that, there's various perspectives within a caucus, but it is important in matters like this that we get to vote without conscience.
So obviously, Stuart, that was Graeme Campbell there. Very different politics to Senator Fatima Payman, as you can imagine. But Labor dissent, again, rare, especially in the modern day. But this has gone back a while. And I think we really need to start Billy Hughes and the party that became the Nationalists, which became the UAP, which became the Liberal Party, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Billy Hughes, I guess, is the big one with National Labour Party, of course, splitting over the question of conscription during World War One, and I guess that's probably the biggest one. Of course, that's the Prime Minister leading the party as well. A lot of these splits are usually like opposing the Prime Minister or another faction, but in this instance, you've got the Prime Minister himself splitting from the party, and that, of course, eventually ended up joining in with what would become the National Party and what would become the Liberal Party, the UAP, during that process. But yeah, that's probably the biggest early split in any part of Australian politics. Of course, ignore the 1910s, the early 1900s. That's just a chaos for everyone involved, as I'm sure you and I both know. But Billy Hughes being the first big split there.
Yeah, absolutely. And what he did, right, the National Labour Party barely existed, right? It was kind of a temporary limbo period. Then they formed a merger with the Liberal Party, aka the Commonwealth Liberal Party, Fusion Liberal Party, whatever you want to call them, Deakin Liberal Party. There's a lot of names. You get the idea. And then, of course, they merged with the Nationalists there. But I mean, that is, hugely significant. And unlike, of course, in the other cases we're going to talk about, or in the current Fatima payman situation, you don't have the party leader going against Hughes for doing this, because he was the party leader. It just was an extraordinary situation.
I mean, you're looking at a time where Labor's rule against crossing the floor didn't really exist yet. It wasn't really formalised. And this, I reckon probably part of it was because of this. No doubt, going back to this very early split, because, yeah, Labor crossing the floor to the extent that they crossed permanently. And, of course, set Labor back, and they weren't really a presence, at least federally, until the 1920s, because, well, you took half the party. And I guess that indicates that typically with the Liberal Party, or then their predecessors, tend to merge and re-merge and split often. Whereas Labor doesn't split often, but when it does, it really does split. As again, DLP, Democratic Labour Party, being the other big split that everyone knows. They're also little splinters, but they do have these occasional big splits. Whereas the Liberals, Nationals, whatever you want to have, they tend to, constantly reforming as they go.
Absolutely. And look, we'll get into the DLP a little later. Of course, you have to look, we can talk about Billy Hughes all day, right? In terms of the parties he was in. He ended up, by the way, it's not often you see this. He started, I think, in a socialist league. But he really was in Labor, and then he ended up, by the time of his death, he was in the Liberal Party, which also speaks to how long this guy was in Parliament for. I think it was 3 seats over multiple states. I mean, Billy Hughes, we can do a whole video on Billy Hughes, a whole episode between Parks Place and Capitol Hill on Billy Hughes. I'm sure we will sometime down the line, because he is just such an incredible person in Australian politics, love him or not. Then I'm not sure who in 2024 has hugely strong opinions about Billy Hughes. We'll fast forward about 20 years, right? Jack Lang. Again, we could talk about Jack Lang for a while, but he was involved in, I guess, a number of splinter parties, including not just in his home state of New South Wales. It's also affected other places like South Australia. But Lang Labor, talk to us about that.
Lang Labor is probably, of the 3 big splits, this is the one people talk less about. I believe he's tried to split off twice. Of course, he was the Premier of New South Wales in Labor there. Again, probably a party leader who did split off, or in a way they're very much dissenting. He was adopting policies that were more, I guess, akin to FDR in the US, ones that were a bit more like welfare based, and that of course didn't gel well with federal Labor, and ended up causing Lang Labor to split off. And so for a couple of elections there, you had, again, 2 Labors, and that's going into World War II, because you didn't get Curtin and that kind of, seals the deal, the end of Lang Labour when you get Curtin in. But the Curtin, Shefflin, and those the three leaders there. But going into early World War One, you did have this kind of Lang Labour split. Even when they did remerge, they again split later on because you already had the seeds already sown for it. So you had a bit of dissenting there, a bit of instability there. And I'm sure, again, that's also played a role in cementing that no dissent rule, no crossing the floor in Parliament.
And it was interesting, right, Stuart, because this Lang Labour thing, I mean, we talked about National Labour, right, which lasted, what, a year, less than a year? Lang Labour as a party was going on for 2 decades in various forms. It was a faction, of course, as well. And it's interesting reading the Wikipedia page on it. And this one particular line, quote, after a series of unity conferences, Lang Labour was readmitted into the official ALP in 1936, with Lang remaining the party state leader. He was deposed in 1939, and then they formed another party, the Australian Labor Party non-communist, which should not be confused. And again, this happens with splits, should not be confused with the Australian Labor Party anti-communist, which we'll get to in a second, the DLP. But yeah, he had this kind of impact until, again, like 1950, so right throughout World War II. Again, Lang as a person is quite extraordinary. But that's pretty significant in terms of how long Labor, especially in New South Wales, is having to deal with a splinter party, another party taking its name, and with a very significant figure leading it.
Definitely, and of course that goes into your early Menzies years, and it's still causing a problem in the early Menzies years. We all talk about the World War II 3 prime ministers. You've got from starting in 1942 to 1949, you've got a strong Labor prime ministership there. But even then, Jack Lang's causing them problems. Of course, they did have a strong majority. Well, of course, you had the National Cabinet to start with during the war, but they did keep that control. Of course, you've got the federal referendums where they tried to get more of these social welfare-based changes into the constitution. Of course, the big one there, the big successful one being what's now the welfare power, which is ironically what Jack Lang was supporting. Labor finally came around on that and they said, yeah, we'll put that in. They got Menzies to side with them on it. So they actually got, there's one for you, Menzies supported social welfare. How's that for breaking trends? But even during this whole time, you've got Jack Lang agreeing with them for once on that. But a general opposition to them, thinking that they weren't doing enough for the working class during the Great Depression, which is where he really came in. Again, you draw the FDR comparison there, where you've got that more involvement from, I guess, the welfare perspective. But not just that, he still was a pretty successful, I think it's like economics. Of course, he was originally the treasurer. So he has that background as well. So solid economics, solid welfare. And that's really a problem for Labor, because you do have this, we mentioned, of course, it being the non-communists or the anti-communists, and being several splits there over that issue. But you do get the sense that this is a question that Labor dealt with through the 50s, but also through the 60s and the 70s, with DLP, of course, we'll get to in a second. But you do have this. He was successful, he was popular, and so when he split, a lot of the party went with him. He was never in contesting for the prime ministership, because Lang Labor never had enough votes to get to that. Of course, you can't call it splitting the vote because we've got preference voting. So if this was America, you call it splitting the vote. Fortunately, we have preferential voting, so that never really happened. But Lang never in the running there to be the prime minister. They're still smaller than Labor. So they were the third party. Labor and, of course, what's now the Liberals were still the big two. But you do have Lang Labor in there as a force against Labor Party themselves, stealing Labor seats, but not having much success in Liberal seats.
And I note, obviously, on the preference question, just going back a bit, when National Labor was formed, it was still first past the post. And they only lasted a year. And then, of course, they merged into the Nationalists. But if you imagine National Labor had stuck around for a bit longer, the kind of mess that would cause, especially for Labor. But it didn't happen, at least federally. Moving quickly on to other parties with the name Labor in them, the Australian Labor Party, anti-communist, which became the Democratic Labor Party. Now, we stress that party disbanded in the late 70s. The current party, I know it claims its history. It's not the same party. They were different parties, same name. But the DLP, we'll say DLP just for the sake of it, even though they weren't known as that originally. And again, that is a pretty well-known one. Of course, it's in the memories of some people still alive today.
Exactly. That is the third of the three big splits. It's probably the most well known of the three because it's more recent. And as you still had Jack Lang, the Lang Labor causing problems, you've then got, well, okay, DLP splits, you're Catholic, right? And we'll come back to that being a bit of an issue for Labor in the first few decades. But the Catholic right splitting or disagreeing with the rest of the parties is where you get your anti-communism again coming into it, because saying that Labor is moving too close to the Soviets. This is, of course, 1950s, talking about domino theory, which was dominant in US foreign policy. And of course, that comes to the Australian foreign policy, is that if one country falls, other countries will fall and follow them. So this policy of, this is your peak US anti-communist period, that influencing DLP here and the Liberal Party. Whereas Lang Labor was never in contesting for the prime ministership, DLP were. They were a lot more popular.
And they were big in the Senate as well, which was really key.
Exactly, yeah. Having that Senate seat, and of course that goes to Whitlam, goes towards the Whitlam years, where you still have DLP causing problems with the Senate. Of course, not to the same level because they did die off in the 70s a bit. Of course, they did end up dissolving them as well. But you've got this split in the 50s. You've got Everett trying to deal with this. He was the foreign affairs minister during the late 40s, running the UN, and also passed legislation in Australia. Of course, the only person to resign from the High Court and go back into politics. So it was his leadership during that time, and he managed to hold the party together enough to get them through to the 1960s, where they started chipping away at Menzies. But the DLP there, kind of during the Menzies years, meant that Labor could not replace Menzies until could not take over enough to get Menzies taken out, and they couldn't do that until, in fact, Whitlam at the very end of the 60s there, start of the 70s, because that's one of the reasons why we have this Menzies prime ministership, longest serving prime minister in Australia, both consecutive and non-consecutive. And this is why you had a DLP, they're kind of, whether you want to call it sabotaging or siphoning or splitting the vote. Ultimately, they did manage to steal enough seats from Labor that Labor was on a force for a while.
Yeah, exactly. And DLP themselves were pretty short on seats once the incumbents who had defected, ran for re-election. That was evident in the state level as well. A lot of them just weren't around for that long. The Senate, of course, was a different story, as we mentioned. And by the way, just on Menzies DLP, I believe that Menzies did vote for the DLP in his later years. I just had to mention that because I've seen that around. Moving back, I should say, to something a bit less known, right? Because there are plenty of splinter parties that were among rank and file members, or just among like a single MP decided to do it, or at the local level. The Protestant Independent Labor Party, which was around for some years, and again is one of those parties that's come off Labor. Didn't have too much success though. What do we actually know about this? Because I would bet that from those who have watched the whole way through, a lot of them wouldn't know a thing about this.
Yeah, so this is the very, very beginning of the kind of the Catholic versus Protestant fight within Labor Party, DLP being the big end of it. But this goes the whole way back again. A thing that people often skip over is that the conscription issue in Labor was largely a religion thing. There was a lot of talking like the Quakers, for example, in the US, but you've got a big religious split over conscription and whether or not you should send the boys to fight in a foreign war. And that's where you come into the progressive, the Protestant Labor kind of splitting off because of largely this religious issue. Of course, they did literally call themselves the Protestant Independent Labor Party, so you've got that in there. And again, James Scullin was the first Catholic Prime Minister. He was Labor. Catholics and Labor go back to the very, very beginning of Australian politics, or at least after Federation. And again, it wasn't overly successful. As you mentioned, like once the defectors are no longer in office, the party dies off. We had the same thing here, Walter Skelton, and of course, the only reason he was succeeding in New South Wales was because you had the multi-member seats. If you didn't have that, that wouldn't really be an issue. And of course, this
Yep,
he,
we
he
had
kind
Hare
of
Clark for a bit in the 1920s in New South Wales. Bring it back, I say. But go on.
Yeah, so that split off in 1923. It did pretty much die off. The party kept going for a while, but that pretty much died off. Well, because Skelton lost he was out of power with the 1927 elections, and 1928 he stood for a by-election. And once he was out, that really died off. They did stay on with in Queensland and South Australia, but again, one MP each. And this is during the Billy Hughes years, and they still managed to get some success, but not much. By the time they were going when Jack Lang split off, but going as in, well, they only had one MP left, and that was in Queensland at that point in time. But it does speak to this issue of Catholics and Protestants within Labor, because you had the Social Democrats in there as well. This is the very, very early few decades. And so this kind of speaks to this issue that people think of, DLP, Catholic right, splitting off. So this is more subtle, but that split does go back to the 20s, to the 1910s. It does indicate that there's not one Labor. It's transforming as it goes. Catholics were the dominant force in Labor. You get to DLP, and that's the Catholic right splitting off. But the non-Catholic party leadership there, because I mentioned James Scullin. So this is your early years strong Catholic force. By the time of the DLP, the Catholics dying off, and that's a more secular party. Of course, the Liberals are usually seen as being Protestant conservative, but even they're becoming a bit more secular as Christianity loses its popularity a bit as you look at the census results. But these early years, very much a religious issue within Labor as they're trying to reform their party image moving along. So, of course, you do have the Irish Republicans playing a role in early Labor years as well. That was in the 1910s, early 1920s, but that was pretty much died off by the early 1920s, which is when Protestant Independent Labor formed. So you do have a couple of these issues, this issue of relationship with the Crown and the issue of faith in Labor playing a role. There were several splits at this point in time. Protestant Labor probably being the biggest one. We say biggest. They had 3 MPs, and only because you had the multi MP seats. Had you not had that, they wouldn't be an issue, because they never secured, none of their candidates ever secured enough of the vote to be elected on their own right, although you didn't really have preferential voting and you got multi-member seats. So do you really know? Well, we can't say for certain. Skelton himself might have been elected if he had one party seat, one MP seats, but it's this early origin of the idea of Labor can dissent, and this non-dissenting rule that we have now, with Fatima Payman's is now looking at herself after crossing the floor. It's again in response to all of these splits that Labor brings in this rule.
Yeah, exactly. I'm conscious of time here, but it's just interesting going through the Wikipedia category on ALP breakaway groups, and there's so many. Rex Connor Labor, Blackburn Mutton Labor, the current day Family First was formed by 2 Labor ministers, Industrial Labor, Industrial Socialist Labor, Majority Labor, the National Party in South Australia, not the current Nationals, North
Family
Queensland Labor.
Right. So that's still an issue.
Yeah, exactly. The Official Labor Movement, Parliamentary Labor, Progressive Labor, Queensland Labor, which was an offshoot of the DLP, State Labor, and the United Australia Party, the old Menzies era one, was actually formed from a Labor split. Look, just quickly, Stuart, we always, well, I say we always, I like to tweet it, talk about a 4th Labor split, whether that could ever happen. We know, obviously, that there are 2 very clear factions within Labor left and Labor right. In some way, they've, at least federally in the caucus, have formed agreements and not split again. And we've mentioned that they're trying to avoid massive situations like this. Can you ever foresee an issue significant enough that would actually break Labor apart? Maybe not necessarily on a major scale like DLP, NLP, Lang Labor, but, in a few branches, you could have entire branches turning to a new party or something like that. Could you ever foresee that?
Yeah, look, it's definitely if it does become an issue, this might be one of the causes of it. Would be this split over Israel and Palestine. Uh, but it is a topical issue. We don't know how long the war's going to go on for. There's two-party state solution or two-state solution or what
You're too
happens there
involved in
definitely could
politics.
play a
Two
role.
party solution.
Yep, I mean it pretty much is considered as the national cabinet in Israel now. But yeah, two-state solution, not two-party solution. Yeah, exactly. But this could become a cause. Of course, we have had a few alarm bells going. Well, is it again family first was revived by two Labor MPs? You do go, well, is this going to be a split? No. Fortunately for Labor, they haven't had a major split in recent times. It's more of a shaving off the edges kind of approach. You'll have one person splitting here, one person splitting there. Official Labour movement, for example, two council seats they split off in the 1950s, just before DLP, but they died off when DLP started. You do have these little fractions and splinters there, but that's usually only one or two MPs. You don't have the same extent to this Liberal Nationals, of course. They could be splitting now in New South Wales over a dispute there, so you don't have the same level. And fortunately, that no dissenting rule has kind of kept that controlled. Although if they have a fourth split, it'll be massive because this has kind of kept down dissent in the party. If there's a resistance to this, it will be a big split. And because the dissenting rules kind of kept everyone all together, no crossing the floor. But as soon as something causes a split, it will split massively because you've got this tension in the party when these split. And of course, Fatima Payman is kind of an example of that. But it is just one MP here. But if we have a split, it'll be a big split.
All right, we will be watching all of this with interest. There are just so many, as you mentioned, there of these little tiny ones, Blackburn, Mutton, Progressive Labor, that have really just emerged of a handful of people and haven't really had much impact, but they're still breakaway groups, big or small. That is between Parks Place and Capitol Hill for today. Remember, you can, of course, stream every single episode of the program on the 6 News YouTube channel and watch all the latest headlines live 24/7. Also on the 6 News YouTube channel and our website, SIXNewsAU.com. We can also access the latest GovCheck content. I'm Leo Puglisi.
Stuart Jeffrey, thank you for watching.